In 270 BCE, a philosopher named Arcesilaus took control of Plato's academy. Instead of preserving his predecessor's search for universal truths, he turned the institution into an engine of radical skepticism. Here, in the physical grounds of the academy in Athens, the most prestigious intellectual center of the ancient world adopted a doctrine of targeted destruction. Reconstructing this shift is difficult because Arcesilaus left behind absolutely no written texts. He refused to publish his findings, and he asserted no positive philosophical doctrines of his own. To execute his takeover, he revived the primary methodology of his intellectual model, Socrates. He adopted the dialectic, a method of relentless oppositional questioning. He aimed this method directly at the highly structured philosophical movements emerging in his era. His primary targets were the Stoics, who claimed they had discovered a reliable system for absolute certainty. Arcesilaus did not build a competing system of knowledge. He designed a method exclusively to burn down the systems of others, carefully ensuring his own beliefs remained completely hidden. The skeptic's dialectic has an absolute rule: argue strictly using the opponent's premises. The skeptic guides deductions step by step until the logic contradicts the original premise, creating a state of contradiction called aporia. Relying entirely on the opponent, the skeptic asserts no facts, remaining undefeated. By weaponizing an opponent's own logic against them, the skeptic proves that no claim is safe from contradiction. This clears the path for their ultimate objective, the total suspension of belief. To understand the scale of Arcesilaus's attack, we have to look at the exact target he intended to dismantle: the Stoic theory of knowledge. The Stoics had built a rigid empirical system to explain how humans acquire truth. This flowchart maps the Stoic pipeline of perception. Reality, or an external object, generates an impression on the mind. The human mind must then choose whether to grant its assent to that impression. If it does, it forms knowledge. The entire system relies on a critical vulnerability created by Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. He inserted a strict mental requirement between the impression and the assent, called the cognitive impression, or catalepsis. Catalepsis refers to an apprehension that is entirely self-warranting. For an impression to pass through this filter, it must be so exceptionally rich and precise in its detail that it guarantees it was caused by a real physical object. By definition, a cognitive impression cannot possibly be false. The Stoics paired this with a strict ethical rule. They argued that a rational, wise person must restrict their assent to these flawless, self-warranting cognitive impressions and reject all ordinary opinions. If Arcesilaus can prove this specific filter is flawed, if he can show that no impression is entirely self-warranting, the entire Stoic promise of infallible human wisdom collapses. Arcesilaus begins his dialectical attack by accepting the Stoic premise that impressions exist, but he directly attacks the idea that the representational character of any impression can guarantee its own truth. He deploys counterexamples, starting with manufactured identical items. Consider a pair of identical wax seals, stamped sequentially from the exact same gold signet ring. This diagram applies Arcesilaus's logic to the Stoic system. If you present a person with two identical inputs, like twin eggs or identical wax seals, they produce the exact same visual data in the mind. The Stoic filter fails here. It is impossible to distinguish the true object from the completely indiscernible false object based on the richness of the visual data alone. The detail does not guarantee accuracy. He then deploys a second, more extreme counterexample: abnormal mental states. He points to individuals experiencing illusions, fits of madness, or highly vivid dreams. This leads to a devastating deduction, mapped here. If a hallucination bypasses the reality node entirely, but still produces an internal mental signature that perfectly mimics waking reality, then the quality of the impression itself cannot be used as proof of objective truth. Because false impressions can perfectly mimic true ones under any circumstance, the required standard of the cognitive impression is impossible to meet. The Stoic logic engine is broken. The first unavoidable conclusion of Arcesilaus's attack is severe. Without cognitive impressions to rely on, absolute knowledge is impossible. This state is known as inapprehensibility, or the inability to firmly grasp any truth. The second conclusion turns the Stoics' own ethical rule against them. They had argued it is irrational to assent to something less than absolute certainty. Therefore, if certainty is impossible, a wise human must assent to absolutely nothing. The Greeks called this radical, resulting state of mind epoche, a term defined as the universal suspension of all judgment and belief. Arcesilaus had successfully used rigorous logic to destroy the possibility of knowing anything. But by completely severing the link between perception and truth, he seemingly trapped the human mind in an unlivable void. The Stoics launched an immediate and furious counterattack against Arcesilaus's universal suspension of belief. They charged him with apraxia, which means complete inaction. The core of the Stoic objection is that human action requires an agent to believe in what they are doing. If you truly suspend all belief about what is good, bad, or even real, you will be physically paralyzed, unable to move at a crossroads. Arcesilaus defended himself against this threat of paralysis by proposing a practical criterion. This is a theoretical framework that allows a human to act successfully and reasonably without ever giving their rational assent to a belief. Because the ancient records of Arcesilaus's exact arguments are brief, his solution has sparked a massive debate among modern scholars. This debate has resulted in 3 distinct interpretations of how the skeptic survives without belief. To solve this paradox of action, we are forced to completely redefine the relationship between logic, belief, and the mechanics of human choice. This diagram breaks down the 3 scholarly interpretations, starting with Model 1, non-rational non-belief, or NRNB. The pathway moves directly from stimulus to impulse to action, completely bypassing reason. Here, the rational mind is paralyzed by opposing arguments. They act purely on natural animal impulse. Model 2 is rational non-belief, or RNB. A logic path lights up, but the final switch for belief is visibly flipped to off. The skeptic carefully navigates treating ideas strictly as hypothetical models, never committing to fixed truths. Finally, Model 3 is non-rational belief. The belief node triggers action, but the connection line to philosophical justification is severed. Under NRB, the skeptic permits themselves to hold everyday beliefs based simply on what seems reasonable. What they abandon is the demand that these beliefs possess absolute, scientifically justified theoretical proof. These models represent extreme differences in human cognition. One reduces us to animal instinct, one to detached hypothetical calculators, and one to unwarranted intuition. Regardless of which model is historically accurate, all 3 prove a profound point against the Stoics. Effective human action in the real world does not actually require absolute philosophical certainty. Arcesilaus decoupled human action from the requirement of absolute certainty. He established a practice of investigation that refuses to treat any conclusion as final, and instead insists on further examination as a way of life. The ideal academic skeptical life requires a difficult balance. It demands a relentless commitment to rational inquiry, paired with the deep humility required to accept that we may never find ultimate truth. Arcesilaus demonstrated that logic could be used to challenge every dogmatic claim without ending the investigation itself. He proved that the search for truth is a valid and necessary process, even if the final destination remains out of reach.